The sun was barely up when Vernon LeBen unlocked the door and turned the sign to open. A thin April chill still hung in the air along I-94 near Battle Creek. Vernon was 21 years old, an airman from Southfield, Michigan, and tomorrow he was getting married. The thought likely followed him through the morning. He probably imagined the ceremony, the faces he knew would be there, the life he would begin afterward. The gas station job? It was just a side gig to help fund his future, one he pictured as bright. Customers came and went. Vernon went about his shift as normal. He had no way of knowing that somewhere nearby, a man he'd never seen was watching him. He didn't know that this man carried years of anger and grievance. To Vernon, it was a normal morning with a future that held limitless promise. When investigators arrived later that day, that promise was already gone. Michigan State Police found Vernon LeBen dead behind the counter, killed during what appeared to be an armed robbery. The register had been open. Cash was missing. Gas station robberies weren't uncommon, and neither, regrettably, were the casualties that sometimes followed them. The fatal shot was fired at close range. It was deliberate and controlled. This had not been a panicked act, or a moment of chaos that spiraled out of control. It was a choice. But with no witnesses and no suspect, the case grew cold. Weeks later, police in Elkhart, Indiana, responded to a very similar scene at another gas station. This time, the victim was 33-year-old Charles Edward Snyder, who was working alone when he was robbed and shot. 5 men who'd been heading out on a Memorial Weekend fishing trip found the body when they stopped at the fueling station around 6 a.m. on Saturday, May 30th. When the service attendant didn't come out to fuel their vehicle, remember, this was the era of full-service gas stations, they went inside, finding it strange that the gas station lights were off, but the door was unlocked. When no one came to the register to help them, they started looking around, and that's when they stumbled across the body in the back room. Snyder had died from 2 .22 caliber gunshot wounds to the back of his head at close range. The 2 crimes were in different jurisdictions, different states, and in the 60s, communication between police departments wasn't as streamlined as it is now. You would think that no one would have connected the dots right away. However, Michigan State Police had coincidentally sent out a bulletin about the murder of Vernon LeBen to police departments in the entire region just that past Saturday. So Elkhart investigators immediately reached out to MSP for more information. For their part, MSP immediately initiated roadblocks on main highways heading north from Elkhart into southwest Michigan. While the roadblocks were unsuccessful, a Michigan State Police trooper on a routine patrol spotted something else suspicious that same day, an apparently abandoned Chevrolet by the side of the road near Kalamazoo. As he peered inside the abandoned car, he saw numerous papers scattered about. Then, as he walked back to take a closer look at the license plate, he saw reddish-brown stains by the trunk lid. Sensing trouble, he had the vehicle towed to the nearest state police post. At the very same time, a local woman named Thelma Smock was at that police post, frantically filing a missing persons report for her husband, Gary, a 30-year-old junior high school teacher from Plymouth, Michigan. She hadn't heard from him since 6 p.m. the night before, when he called to say that he would join her at her parents' soon. When Thelma overheard the trooper describe the abandoned Chevrolet, she immediately recognized it was her husband's car. Police forced open the trunk, hoping to find clues to the missing man's whereabouts, but they made a grim discovery. Inside lay the body of Gary Smock, face down in a pool of blood. An autopsy later revealed he'd been shot, just below the ear, with a small caliber .22 firearm. Disturbing details pointed to the cruelty of his final moments. A cord was tied around one wrist. He'd been bound. His shoes were missing, and his wristwatch was gone. The pathologist estimated that Smock died within 5 minutes of the gunshot, sometime between early morning and early afternoon that Saturday. Police began to canvass the area between Allegan, Smock's last known sighting, and the location of the abandoned car, hoping for any clue to reveal a killer who was still on the loose, threatening their communities. That threat didn't end with a shootout or a chase, but with a phone call. On June 5, 1964, police received a report from a man named Arthur Booth, who was deeply concerned about his friend. The friend was 19-year-old Larry Raines, who was rambling about having killed people and threatening to hurt himself. Just before midnight on June 4th, officers surrounded Booth's house. Raines walked outside, wearing Gary Smock's stolen wristwatch and shoes, and surrendered without a fight. The murder weapon, a chrome-plated .22 caliber pistol, was in his possession and was promptly seized. What followed was unexpected, in both speed and scope. On the drive to the station, without prompting, Raines started to talk. He confessed to the murder of Gary Smock. The kindly teacher had seen Raines hitchhiking on Michigan back roads as Smock was headed from Allegan to Battle Creek. Once inside the car, Raines pulled out a gun, forcing Gary to pull over on a rural road. Once parked, Raines forced Gary into the trunk of his own car and tied him up. Raines jumped in the driver's seat and started prowling gas stations for his next target. It wasn't long before he heard Gary banging around in the trunk, likely trying to break the lock. Raines pulled over, opened the trunk, and shot Gary at point-blank range. After that bombshell, Raines continued his story, because to the officer's shock, he wasn't done confessing yet. After killing Gary, he drove to Elkhart, Indiana, where he spotted the Imperial service station on Cassopolis Street. Despite it being nearly midnight, the area was busy, so Raines found a dark, secluded place to pull over and wait. Seemingly unaffected by the thought of the murdered man in the trunk of the car, he fell asleep. Around 4:30 he awoke and returned to the all-night service station. He pulled up to the pump, and the unsuspecting Charles Snyder came out to fuel up the vehicle. Raines went inside to prepare an ambush. Once Charles came back inside, Raines immediately pulled out his pistol and demanded all the cash on the premises. Charles wisely didn't protest. He unlocked the cash drawer, but that wasn't enough for Raines. He forced Charles into the back room, where he shot him twice in the head to eliminate the only witness. On his way out, he took the entire cash tray, which he emptied and later dumped in a marshy area along a Michigan back road. As the hours passed, the full extent of his crimes became shockingly clear. He admitted to 3 gas station murders, including Vernon and Charles, the murder of Gary Smock, and another murder in Nevada. Piecing all the various ramblings and confessions together, here's the apparent timeline. Raines's violent spree played out over roughly 3 months in 1964. As far as authorities can tell, it began with the murder of Vernon LeBen on April 6, 1964. Authorities can't confirm that Vernon was killed by Larry Raines because Raines himself didn't know the exact name or location of the gas station. However, Raines did confess to killing an Air Force airman in a gas station in southern Michigan during the right time frame. After the murder of Vernon, Raines used the cash to head south, mostly hitchhiking. When the money ran out, he apparently decided that what had worked once would work again. So this time, Raines staked out the F&F Tire Company in Manchester, Kentucky on April 20th, 1964. The attendant, Charles Sizemore, was working the night shift when Raines pulled out his gun. Sizemore survived long enough to be discovered by a passing motorist and transported to the hospital. Unfortunately, though, he passed away a few hours later. Raines was never held responsible for this crime, but contemporary sources suggest that law enforcement was confident that this was the Kentucky robbery and murder that Raines vaguely confessed to. In my own research, this is the only reported gas station murder in that region of the country that fits this timeline, so I'm also confident that this murder can be attributed to Raines. Next, Raines began hitchhiking west towards Las Vegas. We don't know what he did for the next month, but he claimed he was picked up by a solitary driver near Las Vegas, Nevada around May 23rd. For some unknown reason, probably robbery, Raines shot the man and left his body in the desert. I couldn't find any more information about this particular crime. If you know anything more about this one, please feel free to add that in the comments below. After the supposed Las Vegas murder, Raines decided to head back to Michigan. He was hitchhiking on a dirt road near Vegas on May 25th, 1964, when he was picked up by Dave Pitts, a member of the Ice Capades, traveling with his famous performing chimpanzee, Spanky.
Introducing Spanky. They tell us he's the only chimpanzee in the world who can ice skate. The simian star of the flashing blades has a barrel of tricks. Barrels, that is.
Over the next 2 days on the road, Rains bonded with Dave and the chimp until his killer instinct resurfaced on the second night. Out of the blue, he pulled his gun on Dave as they drove through the darkness and chillingly told him about the people he'd killed. "You know, the more people you kill, the easier it gets," Rains said to the stunned man behind the wheel. Rains forced Dave to lock himself in the chimp's cage in the back of the vehicle, essentially holding man and chimp hostage together and overnight. Dave later recalled how he whispered to his chimp like a scared father comforting a child, telling Spanky everything was going to be all right, as a maniac drove them through the night. Amazingly, come morning, Rains had a change of heart. Maybe the sight of the chimpanzee hugging Dave stirred some shred of empathy in him. Whatever the reason, he decided to spare their lives. In South Haven, Michigan, Rains finally let Dave and Spanky go, but not before warning, "If you tell anyone about this before 2 weeks pass, I'll find you and kill you." Dave Pitts kept that secret until he saw news of Rains' arrest weeks later. He'd realized the man who held him at gunpoint was the same person now in headlines for a killing spree. By Memorial Day weekend of 1964, Rains was back in Michigan hitchhiking, putting him directly in the path of that kind teacher, Gary Smock. After also killing Charles Snyder in Elkhart, he was arrested in Kalamazoo. At the police station in the early hours of June 5, 1964, Larry Rains astonished detectives by confessing to these 5 murders. He admitted he killed largely for robbery, and that he intended to consume any stolen food and alcohol, and then rid the world of himself once he ran out of resources. A nihilistic plan that he obviously never completed. News of Rains' arrest and confession made headlines in Michigan. A 19-year-old serial killer who preyed on Good Samaritans and gas station clerks was behind bars. The community could breathe a sigh of relief. Rains' trial for the murder of Gary Smock began in the fall of 1964. His defense attempted an insanity plea, pointing to his troubled upbringing and a psychiatric report that diagnosed him as psychologically disturbed. Indeed, doctors noted that Rains' abusive childhood had left deep scars. More on that in a bit. However, a jury ultimately did find him guilty of first-degree murder in spite of that insanity diagnosis. In October 1964, Larry Lee Rains was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As the guilty verdict was read, he bizarrely broke into a smile, according to one news report. Perhaps in his mind it meant he'd achieved a grim notoriety, a winner in some twisted game that he was playing with life and death. So normally that would be the end of the video. I'd be closing with like and subscribe. But if you looked at the title of the video or the thumbnail, you might have inferred that this can't be the end of our story today. Larry Rains wasn't the only murderous Rains brother. Nearly a decade later, his brother Danny would also become a notorious serial killer. The Rains brothers remain one of the few examples of independent sibling serial killers. 2 brothers who committed separate murder sprees without collaborating. How can something like this happen? Well, the story of Larry and Danny Rains forces us to dig deeper into the effects of nature versus nurture, sibling rivalry, and the lasting scars of childhood abuse. We need to understand how one house in Kalamazoo, Michigan could act as an incubator for 2 separate strains of evil. As a side note, before we move forward, I don't like to use first names for criminals in most of our cases because it feels too sympathetic for me. But going forward, I'll be using the Rains brothers' first names to avoid confusion. Larry Rains was born in 1945, about a year after his brother Danny, who was born in 1943 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They were 2 of 4 children, the only 2 boys, sandwiched between an older and younger sister. From early on, the Rains household was troubled. Their father, Arthur, was a violent alcoholic who ruled with an iron fist. He had only one functioning arm, the other was injured in World War II, but he didn't hesitate to beat his kids or break things in drunken rages. In one horrific incident, he drunkenly ran over the family dog with a truck, killing it. In this type of environment, the boys learned to suppress normal emotions. Emotional numbness and aggression became survival mechanisms. Their father also had a twisted sense of competition. He'd make Larry and Danny fight each other for petty rewards, like a few quarters, just for his own perverse entertainment. This constant provocation bred a deep-seated sibling rivalry between the brothers. Neither could stand to lose to the other. Not in a fist fight, not in everyday squabbles. That rivalry only intensified as they grew older. In their teens, they even fought over the same girlfriend, a young woman named Kathy that they both dated in high school. In a bizarre turn of events, both brothers ended up marrying Kathy at different times. Danny married her first and had 2 children with her. And years later, after Danny was out of the picture, Larry married her while he was in prison. It was as if not even marriage was safe from their competition. Now, before we get to the next part of the video, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and liking this video to help our documentaries reach wider audiences. In 1954, when Danny was about 11 and Larry was 9, their father abandoned the family and moved to Florida, taking a job as a gas station attendant. The sudden absence of their abusive father left the Raines children with an unstable home life and a mother who struggled to keep the family together. The boys' behavior worsened during adolescence. Both had a mix of charm and cruelty. Classmates recall Larry as a bully with a friendly smile, who would one minute joke and the next minute threaten someone. Danny, for his part, was quieter in school, but the brothers' mutual competitiveness did still loom large. Without a positive male role model, Larry and Danny only had each other to emulate, and they pushed each other in all the wrong directions. They started drinking alcohol at a young age and getting into petty trouble. At 17, Larry stole a car for a joyride. Caught by police, a judge gave him a choice: juvenile detention or enlistment in the Army. Larry chose the Army, but it failed to straighten him out. Stationed far from home, Larry's discipline issues and aggression continued. In one incident, he chased fellow soldiers with butcher knives during a drunken outburst, landing him in military jail. Within 11 months, the Army discharged him for misconduct, sending the troubled teen back to Kalamazoo in disgrace. Back home in late 1963, 19-year-old Larry felt like a failure. He had no diploma, no steady job, and a head full of anger. To make matters worse, he was nursing a broken heart. For years, Larry had been in an intense relationship with an older woman, a 23-year-old neighbor named Sue, who he'd met when he was just 13. He even helped raise her kids and begged her to marry him. But Sue repeatedly rejected Larry's proposals. In December 1963, that rejection pushed him over the edge. Just before Christmas, Larry ran a hose from the exhaust of his '58 Plymouth into the car while he sat inside. A state trooper found him in time to save his life, and Larry spent about 10 days in a psych hospital afterward. Doctors noted his chronic depression and alcohol abuse, but there apparently wasn't any long-term help that was provided. He was released back into an unsuspecting world with no help and no hope. He later admitted he didn't expect to live long beyond that point. Early 1964 found Larry drifting, literally hitchhiking back and forth across the country, wandering with no clear purpose. In these aimless travels, something in Larry snapped. He would later claim he didn't even know why he started killing. Perhaps, he mused, it was the lover's rejection from Sue, or simply the cold logic of leaving no witnesses after a robbery. Whatever the twisted reasoning was, by the spring of 1964, as we've heard, 19-year-old Larry Raines became a serial killer. For about 8 years after Larry's conviction, Kalamazoo enjoyed relative peace. The crimes of 1964 faded into memory for most residents. Danny Raines, for his part, lived an outwardly normal life. In the mid-60s, while Larry was facing trial, Danny was married to Kathy and raising 2 young children. But behind the scenes, Danny's own inner demons started cracking through his own facade. Danny's marriage was troubled. Frequent arguments and Danny's volatile behavior led to strife at home. The confident, competitive kid had grown into a man with dangerous predilections. In November of 1968, Danny's dark urges burst into the open. In Battle Creek, Danny attacked an 18-year-old woman named Dorothy King. Dorothy was leaving work at a pharmacy one night when Danny, armed with a gun, forced his way into her car. He held her at gunpoint while driving, intending to attack her at a more rural area. But in a stroke of luck and courage, Dorothy King managed to escape. Danny took a wrong turn near Kellogg Community College, and Dorothy seized the opportunity to jump out of the car and flee. Enraged, Danny ditched his weapon and ran off into the night. It didn't take long for police to identify Danny as the assailant. He was recognized by the victim, and his abandoned car was found where she'd been kidnapped. Danny was arrested and in February of 1969 convicted of felonious assault. He was sentenced to 3 to 4 years in prison. During his incarceration, Danny's wife Kathy finally had enough. She divorced him and took their 2 children with her. By the time Danny was paroled in February of 1972, he'd lost his family and spent about 3 years stewing in prison. He was 28 years old, nearly freed, and was a powder keg of anger and resentment. If the story had ended here, Danny might have just been a troubled ex-con trying to piece his life back together. But what happened next would set him on a collision course with infamy. After parole, Danny returned to Kalamazoo in early 1972 and found a job as, maybe ironically, a gas station attendant, the same sort of job his father once held, and the same type of place his brother had targeted. He also began hanging around downtown, where he encountered a 15-year-old drifter named Brent Coster. Coster was a local youth with a troubled home life of his own, a schizophrenic mother, an alcoholic father, and no positive guidance. To a restless kid like Coster, Danny, nearly twice his age, must have seemed like a cool older brother figure. Danny took Coster under his wing. He let the teen stay in a trailer owned by one of his girlfriends, got him a job, and became a mentor of sorts, albeit a sinister kind of mentor. In March 1972, scarcely 4 weeks after his parole, Danny committed his first murder. The victim was Patricia Houck, a 28-year-old woman from Kalamazoo Township. Patricia went missing on March 19th, 1972 after going shopping with her son, Cody, who was only 17 months old. A woman found little Cody wandering alone by himself and called the police. While trying to locate someone who knew Cody, they found Patricia's body a short way off on Peakstock Road. She'd been stabbed to death. Patricia's murder would remain unsolved for months, while her family and community grieved. If Danny had any hesitation or guilt after that crime, it didn't stop him. By early summer 1972, he was preparing to strike again, this time bringing young Coster fully into the crimes. On July 5th, 1972, two friends from Chicago, 19-year-olds Linda Clark and Claudia Bidstrup, were on a road trip to visit Linda's brother in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They never arrived, and after several days with no word from the young women, their families started to worry. Claudia's mother filed a missing persons report with the Chicago Police Department on July 9th. It wasn't until about 2 weeks later, on July 19th, that passing motorcyclists discovered the burned-out Opel Kadett and the charred remains of the two young victims. Investigators theorized that the young women might have picked up a hitchhiker who killed them, maybe like Larry Raines had done years earlier, or that they were abducted from a local bowling alley, as both of the girls were avid bowlers. It turned out that the young women were doing something that many of us have done countless times in our lives: just getting gas. Linda and Claudia simply pulled off I-94 near Kalamazoo to fuel up at a gas station on Sprinkle Road. I was taken a bit aback when I read this location, because while I don't exactly know where on Sprinkle Road the gas station was located, I'm very familiar with that area because I was part of the Kalamazoo Curling Club, which is located just off this interchange. Fatefully, the station attendant on duty that day in 1972 was Danny Raines. The two young women likely saw nothing alarming about the clean-cut attendant and the teenager who was hanging around. Danny and Coster offered to help, perhaps even offering them something inside the station. But once Linda and Claudia had their guard let down, Danny pulled a weapon. In a replay of Danny's earlier crime, they forced the women into a vulnerable position with the intent to essay and kill them. The brutality Linda and Claudia suffered is difficult to recount. After the essay, Danny decided both women had to die. Perhaps wanting to test his protege, Danny ordered Coster to kill one of the girls while he handled the other. Coster tried to strangle one woman with a rope, but couldn't finish the job, so Danny angrily stepped in. Then, as the other girl pleaded for life, Danny coldly instructed Coster to take care of her, too. This time, perhaps out of fear of Danny, Coster did as he was told. He murdered the second girl by himself. In the span of just minutes, both Linda and Claudia were gone. The two killers wrapped their bodies in blankets, placed them in the back seat of the women's car, and drove the car into a wooded area near Galesburg, Michigan, where they set the car on fire. On August 5th of 1972, about a month after the double murder, Danny and Coster were cruising near the campus of Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo when they spotted 18-year-old Pamela Fierno. Pamela was a college student, just trying to get to the mall by hitchhiking, something she frequently did since she didn't have a car. In fact, this was very common on college campuses at the time. Tragically, though, when Pamela climbed into the car with Danny and Coster, her fate was sealed. The pair drove Pamela to a secluded, wooded area by Morrow Lake, outside the city. There, they assaulted her at knife point. Afterwards, Danny strangled Pamela and they hid her body in the woods. By the end of that summer, Danny and Coster had killed at least 4 women. A wave of fear gripped Kalamazoo and the surrounding area. Young women were disappearing or turning up dead. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious. Police were dealing with different jurisdictions and missing person cases, but the community was on edge. At Western Michigan University, students were warned to be careful about hitchhiking or traveling alone. Although this was excellent advice, I'm shocked it was needed. This all took place just several years after another Michigan serial killer had been caught in the college town of Ypsilanti, where he was known to offer young women rides. You can hear more about that story here. As the weight of what they'd done bore down on him, Coster started to crack. In late August of '72, Coster began confiding in some friends on the street, hinting at his involvement in the killings. Unbeknownst to him, though, one of those acquaintances was an informant who passed the information on to authorities. Police began digging into the tip and learned that Coster was often seen with Danny Rains, of course the brother of convicted killer Larry Rains. The idea that both brothers might be murderers was almost unbelievable, but the leads were too strong to ignore. On September 4th, 1972, police picked up Coster for questioning. Faced with evidence and likely overwhelmed by guilt and fear, Coster quickly confessed. He even told police that Danny had bragged to him about murdering Patricia Houck back in March. Finally, to prove he was telling the truth, Coster led investigators to Pamela Furneaux's body. He portrayed Danny as the ringleader, the older man who led him down this dark path and even threatened his life. Coster claimed he was afraid that Danny might kill him if he didn't go along with what he was doing. Armed with the confession, police moved that same day to arrest Danny Rains. Danny was caught by surprise but maintained a cold front. Even as he was charged with 4 counts of murder for Patricia Houck, Linda Clark, Claudia Bidstrup, and Pamela Furneaux, he professed his innocence. But the evidence was mounting. Coster's detailed testimony, Pamela Furneaux's remains, and a witness who claimed she'd camped with Danny near the place where Clark and Bidstrup were found. Danny Rains went on trial in 1973. By now, the story was public and sensational. 2 brothers turned out to be serial killers, each acting without the other. People in Michigan were horrified and fascinated. At Danny's trial, Coster testified as the star witness for the prosecution, recounting the crimes in graphic detail. It was an utterly damning account. Confronted with the evidence, Danny's defense had little hope. In August of '73, Danny, like his brother before him, was convicted. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder for Pamela Furneaux's killing and of second-degree murder for Patricia Houck's. He later pled no contest to the other 2 murders. In total, Danny Rains was sentenced to 4 life sentences, 1 for each young woman he'd brutally destroyed. Because Coster was a minor who cooperated with the police, he got a bit of leniency. He pled guilty to a single second-degree murder for Linda Clark's death in exchange for his testimony. In September of '75, Coster was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. Despite this, the judge wasn't sympathetic, telling the teenage Coster that he deserved to die for what he'd done. The judge's words underscored the community's outrage. But still, because of his age and the deal, Coster did have a slim chance at parole someday. When Danny Rains was let off to serve his time, the immediate horror seemed to be over. With both Rains brothers in prison, people struggled to understand why. How could 2 siblings acting independently both turn out to be serial killers? Was it something about their upbringing? Genetics? Coincidence? Criminologists and psychologists have pondered this Rains brothers case for decades because it's so unusual. One theory that emerged was that sibling rivalry did play a role, at least in Danny's descent into murder. Those who knew Danny speculated he might have been triggered by Larry's infamy. Remember, Larry's arrest in 1964 brought a storm of attention. Headlines, court hearings, even an appeal that went up to the Supreme Court of Michigan in 1971. Danny watched as his younger brother oddly achieved a dark bit of fame as a convicted murderer. When Larry's conviction was briefly overturned on a legal technicality in 1971, Larry was brought back to Kalamazoo for a new trial. At that very time, Danny was fresh out of prison on parole, struggling to restart his life, and it was during that time that he began to murder. On a warped subconscious level, Danny might have wanted to one-up his brother, even in infamy. It sounds almost too twisted to believe, but given their history of competition, even over the same woman, it can't be entirely discounted. Psychologically, though, Larry and Danny were quite different in their crimes. Experts have noted that while both men lacked empathy and had troubled childhoods, their motives and targets diverged. One criminologist put it succinctly: Larry killed instrumentally, targeting only men, while Danny seemed driven by lust and anger, targeting young women. Clearly, their upbringing set the stage. Their father was a harsh man who effectively taught them to win at all costs and to give into rage rather than compassion. But it's important to note, most people from abusive homes don't become murderers. The Raines brothers' stories may remain ultimately inexplicable, a convergence of nature, nurture, and terrible choices. Larry and Danny Raines never again lived as free men after their respective captures. As of today, justice has run its course for the Raines brothers. Danny died in prison of natural causes on January 29, 2022 at age 78. Larry lived to 78 too. He died in prison on November 12, 2023. And perhaps that's the only consoling piece of this tale, that after their rampages they never roamed free to harm innocent lives again. But nothing could eliminate the pain they'd caused. Pamela Fierno's sisters would even say that Danny's death behind bars didn't bring them joy. It only reminded them of what he stole. As a family, we've been robbed of Pam, what she was and what she would have become, said Pamela's sister, Lori. 9 people, full of potential and hope, were gone because of Larry Raines, Danny Raines, and Brent Coster. Speaking of Coster, what was his fate? Well, he spent 48 years in prison, growing from a 15-year-old boy to a 64-year-old man behind bars. By all accounts, he expressed a genuine remorse in his later years. Prison officials described him as a model inmate who took advantage of rehabilitation programs and even earned a degree in prison. But still, Michigan was understandably hesitant to release someone involved in such heinous crimes. Parole was denied repeatedly. But in 2020, despite objections from some who called the decision very troubling, Coster was granted parole and released in January of 2021. At his final parole hearing, Coster didn't minimize what he did. He said, "I know I deserve to spend the rest of my life in prison. I can't even begin to realize the pain and suffering we caused. There's no doubt I deserved to be here." Coster's release after nearly half a century closes one of the final chapters of this saga. In the end, we're left with a tale that's both horrifying and cautionary. It underlines the importance of noticing the signs of serious disturbance. Perhaps if Larry's earlier unaliving attempt and violence had led to longer-term intervention, lives could have been saved. It also shows how cycles of abuse can reverberate, how the cruelty of a father and a destructive rivalry between siblings helped mold 2 men to become lethal. If there's anything to be gained from revisiting this dark story, it's perhaps a renewed commitment to understanding and preventing the kind of abuse and violence that tore apart so many lives. If you believe we've earned it, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you're watching on TV, you can just press up or down to open the video menu, navigate to our channel icon, press OK, and you should see a subscribe button. As a small channel, viewers like you truly do make a massive difference in helping us to get discovered. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.